Hello and welcome to today's episode of pianoTV, where we are going to go off the deep end and talk about modernism in music. So modernism is a movement that happened in the early 1900s, basically between 1900 and 1930, and it ran concurrently to Impressionism in music. And we've actually already done a video about Impressionism if you want to check that out, because they're both pretty different styles. So modernism is I don't want to give too much away because we're going to talk about this in a second, but it's a very abstract style. You had composers like Stravinsky and Mahler, and some of those really boundary pushing, intense, strange composers. So what we're going to be talking about today are the key musical components of the modernist era, as well as the genres that developed and evolved in this period, such as ballet and symphonies. We're also going to touch on the neoclassical movement, which was sort of interlinked with the modernism movement. It gets a little convoluted once we start getting past 1900, but I'll do my best to make it make sense. Anyway, let's get started. In music history, things were pretty clear-cut for a while. You had the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Baroque, Classical, and Romantic eras, and each of them had their own set of really distinct styles and composers. But once we hit the 1900s, everything changed. Western music, which sort of started out as one unbroken string, began to fray into a bunch of smaller strings, and on the screen I just have a very small handful of them. More started happening, more started to change, and all of it changed more quickly than it ever had. And because of that, I can't do a blanket video for the modern era the way I did blanket videos for other eras like the Baroque and Romantic and so on. Since the modern era is so full of little subsets, each of them are more or less entirely worthy of their own video, so we can focus on them. We've already done a video on Impressionism, and today we're going to be kind of looking at modernism. Impressionism and modernism in music sort of ran parallel in terms of time periods, but they're incredibly different in terms of style. So you can check out the Impressionism video if you want to get a little more details, but it was all about abstraction and creating moods, and it's very atmospheric. Whereas modernism, it was all about defying convention to the extreme degree. So one example is that modernist music often rejects tonality. So that just means it's music that isn't anchored in a key, and so it always gives us this feeling of being unsettled or just kind of off sounding. Modernist music sometimes rejects standard rhythmic meters as well. So, you'll see less 4/4 and 3/4, or you'll see pieces that alternate different time signatures all the time. They're never kind of resting in a time signature. Basically, it's music that considers the borders of key and rhythm too stifling. It doesn't even push boundaries. It destroys boundaries. One way that you could describe modernism is an obvious point of historical discontinuity. Profound historical transformation. So if we were to search for a name to convey the breakaway mood of the 1890s, which is a mood symbolized musically by the opening bars of Strauss's Don Juan, but without imposing a fictitious unity of style on the age, we could do worse than revert to Hermann Bahr's term modernism and speak of a stylistically open-ended modernist music extending from around 1890 to the beginnings of our own 20th century modern music in 1910. And some of the pieces we're going to look at today extend beyond 1910 as well. Another way that you could define it is the dissolution of the traditional tonality and transformation of the very foundations of tonal language. So you have things like atonalism, polytonalism, other altered tonality, etc., etc. So basically, music that defies key signatures. So probably the most important and obvious quality of modernism is atonality. I've already said the word 10 times and this video has barely even begun. So basically, we've already talked about this. It's a lack of a tonal center. It was a term that was first used in the early 1900s to describe music with ambiguous chords, more unusual melodies and rhythms. This was a style of playing that was innovated by Arnold Schoenberg, who we're going to talk about shortly here. He was a Jewish composer from Vienna. So what I have up on the screen here is a really specific type of atonality. It's called 12-tone technique. We won't really get into it, but I just want to give you perspective on how heady and kind of intellectual almost that this got. Basically, it was a way of writing that would give all 12 notes on the keyboard, or like whatever instrument you're playing, equal weight. So you're not playing the same note more than, once. So you'll notice in this pattern of 12 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, nothing is repeated. So if you have a B flat over here, you don't have a B flat anywhere else until we repeat the cycle again. So that's kind of how 12-tone technique worked. It was a way of writing so that you never felt like you were in a key signature, because even if you played like this B flat one extra time, you might start to hear that you're in the key of B flat. So it was a way of keeping things really ambiguous. And it does get a little more in depth than that, but I mean, we don't need to. That could be a whole other really strange video. Arnold Schoenberg's Piano Concerto, Opus 42, is a really good example of this. It was composed in 1942, so it is one of his later works, written when he lived in America. But again, I think it's a really good example where you should be able to hear like the extreme dissonance. And actually, Stravinsky, who's another popular composer that we're going to talk about today, he actually criticized the piano writing of this concerto. And another person who criticized it is Mitsuko Uchida, who's a famous piano performer. And they said that Schoenberg wasn't very good at piano, and because of that, he actually didn't write very effectively or very comfortably for piano. So anyway, criticisms aside, let's take a listen to the opening sounds of this concerto so you can truly get a feel for how weird it is. I feel like I'm setting you up for failure by telling you it's so weird, but you'll know what I mean. Like, it's really abstract, especially compared to the music that most of us listen to regularly. In Nazi Germany, atonal music was actually labeled as degenerate, and composers who wrote these pieces had their pieces banned. So Schoenberg at this time was already living in America. It's also worth noting that Schoenberg was a really influential teacher and composer. So Schoenberg, along with his contemporaries and his students, made up a group of composers in Vienna known as the Second Viennese School. Just kind of fun fact, the original Viennese School was the really awesome cool guys Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven. So anyway, they were active in Vienna between 1903 and 1925, and their music evolved from like a little atonal, a little weird, to like full-fledged atonal, and then the eventual use of the 12-tone technique. So some of the well-known composers in this school would be Alban Berg, Anton Weber, and obviously Schoenberg, and many others. Igor Stravinsky was a Russian composer born into a musical family in 1882, and he's particularly known for the music of three really potent ballets, which are Firebird, Petrushka, and The Rite of Spring. So we're going to be talking about his ballet Petrushka today, which is a really great example of modernist rhythm styles. Irregular meters, irregular rhythms, and like more of a driving rhythm in general. So when I say irregular meter, basically I mean any rhythm that alternates. So each bar, or like every several bars, might have a different time signature. Like basically it's not going to be like 4/4 the entire piece. It's going to be more flexible, it's going to alternate. And just while we're on the subject of rhythm in the modernist era, I wanted to mention polymeter, even though we're not going to specifically listen for this in Stravinsky's Petrushka. It's a really unusual technique, but it's something you might come across. Basically, the idea of having two different instruments do different time signatures. So maybe, like in this case, this is a really simple example, but maybe the violin is playing a 5/4 beat, and then the piano, let's pretend this is piano, is doing a 4/4 beat. And they're going to align in different ways, and it creates a really unusual effect, as you might imagine. Aside from Stravinsky bending rhythms, you can also hear how orchestration was evolving in this period. There was more percussion, like the xylophone was added, more drums, and more of a rhythmic backbone. We're not going to be hearing that in this specific example, but if you start listening to some modernist music, you can really get a sense of like how epic and powerful the drums are in this time. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a part from the second movement of Petrushka. And instead of listening to the full orchestral version, I've actually found us a clip that is a piano duet for four-hand piano, because I feel like it's easier to note the meter changes in the sheet music. It's easier to follow along and really like hear. Well, I mean, it sounds really weird and abstract in the symphony version too, but I just feel like it's easier to pinpoint these concepts. So let's take a listen. In the hands of Gustav Mahler, the symphony transformed into an even larger beast. Like in the Romantic era, it was already a huge, expansive symphony, but he just like took it and ran. So his 8th symphony from 1906, for example, is nicknamed the Symphony of 1,000 because the sheer number of vocalists involved, which 2 soprano, alto, tenor, bass choirs. There was a children's choir, there were 8 soloists. So I mean, not quite 1,000, but a lot of people singing. Another example of his like huge scope of writing was his 3rd symphony, which is over an hour and a half long, and a lot of its symphonies were very involved. Mahler, along with some of his contemporaries, was said to compose symphonies that were extraordinary in scope, richness, originality, and urgency of expression. Mahler's music can be thought of as a link between the late Romantic composers such as Wagner to the modernist composers such as Schoenberg. There's a lot more traditional musicality in it, even though you can kind of tell it's leaning in that modernist direction. So we're going to be taking a quick listen to the 4th movement from his 5th symphony. It's a very slow, beautiful movement that he apparently wrote for his wife. It's kind of romantic. And it can be described as a conventional symphony by an unconventional composer. Let's have a listen. Between the 2 world wars, some composers wanted to get back into the balanced and ordered style of classical music. I mean, music had become really formless and abstract by this point, so there was a counter movement to give it form again. So some composers who wrote music in this genre, I say in air quotes, you can't see my hand, would be Stravinsky, Poulenc, Hindemith, and Satie. So right now we're going to be taking a listen to Francis Poulenc's Concerto Champêtre. Did I get it? Did I get it, my French friends? Anyway, it's a harpsichord concerto written between 1927 and 1928. And I think it's a really cool concerto for a lot of reasons. Like, first of all, you have the small sound of the harpsichord, which is the feature instrument, up against a full orchestra, which creates this really cool contrast. And then you also have the fact that the feature instrument is a harpsichord, which is a direct and obvious callback to the Baroque period. And it wasn't a popular instrument at the time, but it sort of gained a little ground in Baroque revitalists. So as such, this is a really great example of neoclassical writing, although you could get even more specific and label it neo-Baroque writing. Basically, the idea is the same, like mixing the old with the new, a little bit of a throwback to older times and like a more clear-cut music style. So I'm not going to leave you with a clip for this one just because I don't have access to one, but I'll leave you with a link to a performance of this concerto, which you should definitely check out because harpsichords are just really neat instruments. So let's take a listen to that. I'll leave it up there. You can go do it yourself and I'll wait. Or you can do it after this video because this video is almost over. And that is all for today's tour through the modernist era, a really kind of unique and interesting thread of musical history. If you like this history video, you'll probably like some of our other similar ones. We've actually gone through a lot of the major ones. We've already talked about the Baroque period, the Romantic period, the Classical period, and we've talked about Impressionism as well. So I really like doing these videos. I think history is fascinating. And if you're learning pieces by Schoenberg, if you're learning pieces by, Stravinsky or any of these people, it really helps to understand the context in which the music was written. So without further ado, I will catch you guys in the next video. So Schoenberg at this time was already living in America. So I guess he wasn't banned, or was he?